Welcome to the North Carolina State Medical Response System Initial Training Program for the State Medical Assistance Team. This presentation covers Module 4, All Hazards. This module has two primary objectives. First, review the history of natural disasters and chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and explosive incidents. Second, discuss natural disasters and biological, chemical, explosive, radiological, and nuclear incidents, including health effects, safety measures, and medical care. In North Carolina, though it is remotely possible, it is unlikely that you will encounter every type of human man-made or natural disaster, particularly events like biological or radiological incidents. However, understanding each of these and the challenges they present can be the key to an effective response. Remember, too, that as an emergency responder, it is essential that you keep yourself safe and well so you can help others. Simply stated, natural disasters are disasters caused by natural forces. These forces can include those that cause earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and extremes of temperature. These natural disasters can be further classified into notice events or no-notice incidents. Natural disasters that are classified as notice events are generally related to meteorological or geophysical phenomena, both of which are under constant surveillance by weather and geological agencies. Weather patterns for many storms can provide initial warnings up to 5 days prior to expected impact. While the amount of warning that predictive alerts may provide will vary from minutes to days, our forecasting abilities are not as robust as you would hope for. For example, tornado alerts may provide only minutes of warning prior to touchdown for the characteristic destructive winds, and warnings about impending volcanoes generally cannot provide exact timing of the expected eruption. Many regions of the world have recurrent patterns of natural disasters, such as the earthquakes and tsunamis along the Pacific Rim. Much is known about the conditions necessary for the development of tsunamis, wildfires, avalanches, or landslides. However, our forecasting and warning efforts rely heavily on effectively informing the public about the possibility and probability of these events occurring. The epidemic spread of communicable diseases can be identified and monitored by disease surveillance efforts in operation at over 80 local North Carolina health departments and the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Division of Public Health. Education of the general public as to the routes of transmission of the epidemic disease may result in limiting the spread of the epidemic, particularly if there are risk factors that will require modification in behavior to mitigate. Recognition of the threats posed by no-notice incidents alone is not sufficient to significantly limit injury, morbidity, or mortality. Each member of the population should understand the nature and severity of the risk and then execute the proper public safety response, like evacuation or shelter in place. As part of planning for disasters, emergency response plans in areas at risk for weather or geophysical disasters should be written, exercised, and regularly updated to include pertinent threats. Examples include plans that define and outline response actions for heat waves, extended snowstorms and blizzards, floods, and hurricanes. Some disasters take much longer to develop and are often identified only after the harmful environmental and human health impacts have already begun. The initiating forces are mostly a complex mixture of natural inputs like drought, political or social decisions like damming a vital water source, and the result of human activity like deforestation or global climate change. The results can be seen in environmental degradation or significant human life impacts like famine. In North Carolina, hurricanes, flooding, and tornadoes represent the most frequent types of risk from natural disasters. Common medical and public health issues would include disruption of regional health services due to damaged infrastructure, shelter health services for evacuees, and injuries to cleanup workers during the recovery phase of the emergency response. We should also point out that it is important for responders to remember that in addition to illness and injury produced by disasters, There will also be profound effects on healthcare delivery systems. First, there may be damaged hospitals and clinics. Second, surviving healthcare facilities may experience a dramatic surge in patient volume. This may be compounded by the fact that many victims will require ongoing treatment for chronic diseases such as diabetes, kidney failure, hypertension, etc. The health impacts of natural disasters are directly and indirectly related to the physical forces unleashed and the environment in which the population experiences the disaster. Additionally, the use of protective or mitigation measures like hand washing in epidemics, storm evacuation, tornado shelters, earthquake-resistant buildings and structures, and properly constructed levees may mitigate injury, morbidity, and mortality from natural disasters. This section will highlight natural disasters that have historically had the greatest relevance to North Carolina in terms of cost and human lives. These are flooding, hurricane, and tornado disasters. With respect to the potential for state medical assistance team deployment, these types of natural disasters have great potential to disrupt the healthcare infrastructure and have a prolonged recovery period. First, we will talk about the adverse health effects of flooding. Flooding may occur as a result of significant rain or snow events causing rivers and streams to swell in or out of their banks. The result may include river flooding or flash flooding, where the flooding occurs rapidly after heavy rains. Additionally, failure of dams or levees may also cause uncontrolled flooding in populated areas. The most significant health threat from flooding is drowning. Victims may be caught by the rapidly increasing and rising water flow of floodwaters. A significant number of deaths associated with flash flooding occur when motor vehicles are washed away as they enter high water in roadways. For example, in late 2010, rain from a regional storm cell dropped more than 22 inches of water on portions of North Carolina. The resulting flooding claimed 7 lives in Bertie County, Dare County, and Pamlico County, most of whom were in their vehicles on flooded roadways. Even a modest amount of flooding may disrupt normal supplies of safe drinking water and the operation of the local sewage disposal system. Concerns about potential outbreaks of communicable diseases like cholera or typhoid fever often arise during a disaster. While generalized outbreaks of communicable diseases do not occur, transmission of waterborne diseases has occurred after flooding. Other health risks arise as a result of flooding. The physical force of rushing floodwaters may damage storage or manufacturing sites and cause the uncontrolled release of hazardous chemicals into the environment, where the population may be exposed. Flooding may cause electrical power lines to be down where persons may come in contact with them, causing electrocution. Traumatic injuries like lacerations and punctures often occur as residents return to their homes to clean up damage and debris. These wound injuries also increase the risk for infections, including tetanus. The stress of damage removal and recovery has led to excessive cardiac strain and heart attacks. Second, we will talk about the adverse health effects of hurricanes. Hurricanes, or tropical cyclones, are created by the release of latent heat from warm ocean waters. In the Atlantic Ocean, hurricane season is from June through November, with a peak in late August, early September. The rotating wind system generally forms over warm tropical waters with sustained winds of at least 74 miles per hour. By the time the wind speed reaches hurricane levels, the storm becomes well organized, a large amount of rain is created, wind speeds increase, and a storm surge swells. A storm surge occurs when the wind and low barometric pressure cause the level of the ocean to swell by 1 to 2 feet. Depending on the storm strength and local ocean floor characteristics, the storm surge may cause the sea to rise 20 feet higher than normal. Damage occurs as a result of wind and the flooding caused by the storm surge, and, to a lesser degree, rain. North Carolina has had more than 110 hurricanes make landfall or travel through the state since statistics were first collected in 1886. Rated by a scoring system that considers wind speeds, storm surge, barometric pressure, and damage potential, North Carolina has seen its share of powerful and damaging storms. While the high-velocity winds of a hurricane can cause structural collapse and force even heavy debris to become dangerous airborne projectiles, it is the flooding that accompanies hurricanes that poses the highest mortality risk for persons in the storm's path. The storm surge is responsible for most of the flooding and drowning risks in a hurricane. The drowning risks in a hurricane are similar to river and flash flooding and is exemplified by the data from North Carolina after Hurricane Floyd. There were 52 recorded deaths associated with Hurricane Floyd that made landfall on September 16, 1999. Of those fatalities, 69% were due to drowning and comprised of 24 who drowned in their motor vehicles, 7 victims who drowned in boats, and 5 victims who perished while on foot or in their homes. Other causes of death included myocardial infarction for 4 persons, fires claimed 2 lives, and 1 each for hypothermia, electrocution, and fall. Visits to emergency departments during the first week following Hurricane Floyd uncovered significant increases compared to the same week 1 year previously for suicide attempts, dog bites, febrile illnesses, and filled prescriptions. Emergency department visits 1 month after Hurricane Floyd showed increases for arthropod bites, diarrhea, violence like assault, gunshots, and rapes, and asthma. Next, we will talk about the health effects of tornadoes. While the Blue Ridge Mountain Range separates North Carolina from the infamous Tornado Alley area of the central U.S., tornadoes occur almost every year in North Carolina, bringing with them risks of injury and property damage. In the 60 years between 1950 and 2010, there have been 1,116 reported tornadoes, causing 114 fatalities and injury to more than 2,500 people. As a recent and significant example, an outbreak of tornadoes on April 16, 2011, killed 22 people and injured 132 in North Carolina, as 62 tornadoes touched down in 22 counties. Tornadoes are rapidly spinning, funnel-shaped air spirals that emerge from a violent thunderstorm, have a wind velocity of up to 200 miles per hour, and can destroy buildings. Severity is rated on the Fujita scale according to the estimated wind speed using a scoring system of F0 as no damage to F5 total destruction. The extent of damage depends on winds within the tornado funnel, the tornado's differential atmospheric pressure, and the effects of flying debris. While weather centers closely monitor the storm conditions conducive to tornado generation, the amount of response time afforded to local communities may be short as tornadoes often occur quickly. Warning and sheltering are the 2 most important factors in preventing injury and death during a tornado. Injuries and death occur when people are struck by objects thrown by the tornado's violent winds or are themselves thrown. The intensity and duration of the tornado and the population density in the path of the tornado are the major factors that influence injury and death rates associated with tornado disasters. Injuries may also occur during rescue and cleanup operations after a tornado has passed. If hospitals or other healthcare facilities are damaged by a tornado, the ability to deliver major health and injury care to casualties may be diminished. Rescue and emergency medical response may be hindered or delayed at the damaged site due to hazardous conditions such as downed, energized power lines and debris blocking roadways. Finally, we'll briefly talk about the health effects of other types of natural disasters. It is possible that SMAT deployments will also need to address other types of natural disasters, particularly if SMAT members are deployed to other regions of the United States or abroad. Whatever the case, it is clear that natural disasters have the capacity to cause a large-scale emergency over a wide geographic region, affecting large numbers of victims. Medical and public health emergency needs of the population will be intertwined. Prevention measures include warning the population of the impending disaster, sheltering of local populations, and/or evacuation. Engineering modalities such as dams to control flooding and building codes to reinforce structures to withstand earthquakes are important to the overall mitigation strategy to preserve human health. The type of disaster, magnitude, severity of the disaster, level of forewarning provided to populations prior to the disaster, and the density of the affected population are major determining factors of the population impact. In these types of situations, there is an even higher likelihood that community medical facilities such as hospitals, clinics, and physician offices will be rendered non-functioning, either because the facilities suffered major structural damage, are flooded, or lose water and electricity, or the personnel that would staff these facilities are injured or cannot physically get to work because of road conditions. As a result, the need for external medical resources to be brought to the disaster site will be increased. There are some health impacts that are generally common to all types of disasters that should be considered in the initial stages of response. Of course, attention should be paid to the specific cause of the disaster, as this will guide planners and first responders in determining the most effective and efficient response. Anticipating the types of health impacts due to specific causes of disasters allows incident commanders and response organizations to organize, coordinate, and provide appropriate support, such as personnel and assets, to the field medical facility. Disaster responders should remember that many of the patients they treat, especially after the initial response period, are individuals who are ill from untreated chronic diseases. These chronic diseases may include asthma, hypertension, arthritis, diabetes, or psychiatric disorders, to name a few. Rapid health assessments within the field medical facility and ongoing surveillance of both staff and disaster victims provide ongoing data on illness and injury patterns and allow for optimal intervention strategies. Disaster victims may present in the field medical facility in a variety of ways, including self-transport, public transportation if it is available, or by organized disaster response vehicles, like buses, ambulances, or helicopters. Staff and trained volunteers in field medical facilities must be able to triage disaster victims, specifically prioritizing the severity of injuries of presenting disaster victims in a systematic way, thereby maximizing the allocation of staff and medical resources to those most likely to survive their injuries. Triage is covered in the mass casualty module and operates under the premise of doing the most benefit for the most patients amid limited resources. It is important to note that there will be limited treatment capabilities as well as evacuation capabilities in a response to a natural disaster affecting a large population. An effective disaster plan clearly details evacuation and transport procedures from the field medical facility to a setting such as a hospital where better care can be provided to critically ill patients. By evacuating the critically ill patients, more personnel, time, and resources can be provided to the less critically ill patients in the field medical facility, improving their outcomes. The evacuation and transport plan should outline all of the logistics involved, including how patients will be evacuated and transported, who will be notified, how they will be notified, which personnel will be involved, safety issues, how ongoing communication and coordination will be handled between the receiving site and the field medical facility, etc. Issues specific to the vulnerable populations, like the pediatric, geriatric, and mentally impaired, should be addressed prior to the evacuation and transportation to the receiving site. Next, we will talk about biological disasters, both those that are naturally occurring in the form of epidemics and intentional releases that can be seen in terrorism. We can define biological terrorism as the deliberate use of any biological agent against people, animals, or agriculture for the purpose of causing disease, death, destruction, or panic for political or social gains. During the late 1960s, the United States ended its biological warfare program. Most developed nations signed the Biological Weapons Convention by 1975 to prohibit the development and use of offensive biological weapons. Until the end of the 1990s, domestic interest in biodefense was diminished to the point that critical laboratories for anthrax were closed and vaccines to respond to smallpox outbreaks languished in diminished stocks that were nearly 25 years old. In 1999, due to increased concern, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention opened the Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Program, a major public health preparedness initiative. The purpose of this office was to improve disease detection, expand critical laboratory services, promote clinical awareness, and to develop a national stockpile of critical vaccines and medications that could be used during a biological agent attack. During the past decade, infectious disease laboratories and surveillance networks for biodefense have been improved throughout our nation's health departments. Biological agent response exercises are part of the preparedness activities of most health departments and hospitals. However, the anthrax attacks of 2001 demonstrate that it is extremely difficult to prevent and provide early detection of a biological agent before large segments of the population are exposed. The first sign that something is wrong may be the sudden appearance of thousands of ill or dying patients at healthcare facilities. In addition, The new advances in genetic engineering and biotechnology allow even a modest laboratory to develop and prepare potential biological agents. Unlike other types of terrorism events, which tend to target infrastructure or vital services, biological agents directly target the population. Emergency medical and public health strategies to identify and contain disease must work together to mobilize the health system if we are to have success in preventing disease in our population. In 2001, shortly after the World Trade Center attack, persons throughout the United States started to become ill with suspicious cases of anthrax. Within a span of 2 months, more than 22 cases of anthrax were identified. 5 people died in Connecticut, New York, Florida, and Virginia from this attack. Prior to 9/11, no cases of pulmonary anthrax had been reported in the United States for nearly 2 decades. In this attack, letters containing anthrax spores were sent to reporters, congressional offices, and various federal departments. More than 30,000 persons suddenly required vaccine or antibiotics to prevent the illness from a potentially deadly anthrax exposure. Identifying suspects can be difficult following a biological warfare attack. The first victim of the anthrax attack was a man from Florida who had spent time hiking in North Carolina. At the time, it was unknown where he had contracted the bacterium. As a result, extensive testing was done in North Carolina to ensure that the anthrax bacterium was not present here. Eventually, this anthrax case was connected to other cases that occurred shortly after 9/11 who were exposed through the mail. Because attribution of the crime was so difficult, it took years until a former biodefense worker was identified as the suspected culprit. This person died before being brought to trial. Many biological agents pose serious concerns to human health. However, biological agents for preparedness were selected because of the vulnerability of human populations to a deliberate release of certain biological agents or their toxin products. These biological agents include viruses, bacteria, and bacterial toxins. Agents that were highly lethal or contagious, or that required specialized preparedness efforts to treat or prevent disease, were designated as the first tier or category A biological agents for public health preparedness, and occupied the bulk of our public health preparedness efforts. Other biological agents that were determined to be less of a threat were designated as Category B or C agents. Public health preparedness for Category A biological agents required specialized awareness, specific preparedness activities, stockpiles of medications or vaccines, and other activities to mitigate the impact of a release into the population. Critical roles for SMAP personnel in response to a biological agent attack would include mass vaccination and mass prophylaxis to prevent illness in persons who were exposed to the biological agent. In addition, the implementation of medical countermeasures would be expected to reduce the spread of disease throughout the population or lessen its impact within the victims. There has been a surge in the appearance of emerging diseases over the past 20 years. These diseases were previously unknown in humans and quickly spread, affecting millions of people in just a few decades. Some of these diseases have serious consequences to human health. As an example, severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, appeared suddenly and was highly contagious via person-to-person transmission. However, this disease disappeared as quickly as it emerged. The parallel between bioterrorism and biological warfare is that both cause diseases that present in the population as a suddenly occurring disease outbreak. New strains of the influenza virus are always emerging. Pandemic influenza has been identified by the Institute of Medicine as the prototype emerging infection in their 1992 report on emerging infections. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, making it one of the most deadly disasters to date. This pandemic was different from other pandemics because of the excess mortality and the high attack rates seen in the 20 to 40-year-old age group. It is important to gain situational awareness during any emergency response. However, unless a biological agent release is announced or is detected by biological sensors, we are left with the likelihood that cases of unexplained illness will appear in physician offices, clinics, and hospitals. At that point, we are initially dependent on clinical diagnosis and laboratory confirmation of our suspicions. SMAT personnel during deployments should be vigilant for the appearance of unusual disease clusters in patients presenting for medical treatment and should report their suspicions to pertinent public health authorities at the state and local levels. Such information will usually trigger a public health investigation designed to explain how the disease is being transmitted, what the causative agent is, and what public health measures need to be implemented to control the outbreak. This handoff between clinical care and public health is critical to an effective biological agent emergency response. It should be noted, if there is a biological incident, there is no 911 call to make. Emergency workers will not know there is a problem until people begin to get sick. As a result, the release of biological agents may go unnoticed for days or weeks. This makes these releases different from chemical releases or nuclear incidents. The public health system exists to detect, identify, and control or prevent diseases in the population. With regard to infectious diseases, the system attempts to detect new cases of common problems in the community, such as tuberculosis. Patients with tuberculosis are followed by many health departments to ensure compliance with medications and that they are no longer contagious and pose a threat to the community. New cases are identified and rapidly referred for evaluation and treatment. A reportable disease is one for which regular, frequent, and timely information regarding individual cases is considered necessary for the prevention and control of the disease. Every jurisdiction has a list of conditions that are required to be reported to the local or state public health authority. To aid in the national effort to control infectious diseases, North Carolina and the other 49 states voluntarily share their reportable disease information with the federal government through the Center of Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. In order to assure the timely detection of diseases important to the public health, a system of disease detection surveillance consistently operates. Persons who have a disease of public health importance may seek medical attention from their physician, clinic, hospital, or other healthcare provider. North Carolina state law requires that these and other providers must inform their local health authority upon suspicion or confirmation of the presence of a reportable condition. These reports can be transmitted to the public health authority by phone, fax, electronic database transfer, email, or letter. Public Health Department epidemiologists collect and collate the reports and conduct analysis of patterns in the reports. By searching for clues within the patterns of disease, new clusters of disease or new places where disease hasn't been found previously can be identified. Based on the surveillance information, epidemiologists conduct field investigations in an attempt to find details about how new cases were spread, where the infection came from, and when the outbreak began. These field observations ultimately lead to a more complete understanding of the outbreak and, in turn, lead to execution of control measures to stop or prevent the further spread of disease in the population. Control measures focus on interruption of the means of transmission and could include actions such as restaurant closures, a boil water order, immunization or treatment of exposed persons, and identification and treatment of sexual partners, to name just a few. Medical and public health issues associated with biological agents include 1. Rapid person-to-person spread, 2. Harm to healthcare workers, and 3. Significant disruption of social and economic components of whole regions. For example, the SARS outbreak of 2002 and 2003 caused various economies to face reductions in their gross national products due to the adverse effects on trade and transportation. In addition, biological terrorism and warfare is extremely cost-effective when compared to the investment needed by a nation or terrorist organization to develop a nuclear, conventional, or chemical weapons program. In addition to directly affecting humans, biological agents may be developed or released to attack specific non-human targets such as animals or plants with the intent of producing economic harm to a population. Such an example would be a deliberate attempt to spread hoof and mouth disease in the cattle-producing areas of the United States. Biological agents affect human health primarily by causing infection in persons who are exposed to the agent, and in some cases, those who come in contact with these victims. The ideal biological agent would cause serious disease within the population, and it would also be sufficiently contagious so that it could continue to move throughout the population, from human to human, causing more and more cases. If no medical countermeasure or public health control measure were available, such an epidemic would likely continue to spread through the entire susceptible population with catastrophic results. Health providers would be at risk, and healthcare facilities would be severely overburdened with the sick and dying. Category A biological agent, smallpox, would be exactly the type of disease to meet such conditions. Smallpox is a virus that is preserved only in a few select research laboratories. The last naturally acquired case of smallpox was reported in Somalia in the late 1970s. The World Health Organization, Assembly, declared smallpox eradicated in 1979. Smallpox is highly contagious and results in an estimated 30% mortality rate in naturally occurring outbreaks. Routine vaccination against smallpox ended in the United States nearly 40 years ago. As such, most of the population in the United States is currently susceptible to the disease. If the biological agent were released today, in the absence of a rapid and comprehensive immunization campaign, along with proper disease surveillance, there would be little we could do to stop the relentless progress of the disease as it moves throughout the population. Such an outbreak could kill millions of people and would rapidly spread to all corners of the world. The economic losses related to the disruption in trade and transportation, the loss of skilled workers, and disruptions in manufacturing would be devastating worldwide. In some cases, toxins produced by bacteria are used to kill or make people seriously ill in biological terrorism or warfare. For example, one Category A biological agent, C. botulinum toxin, causes a clinical syndrome that is commonly referred to as botulism. In this case, the toxin is extracted from the bacteria Clostridium botulinum and is the biological agent that is disseminated to cause paralysis and death in victims. This toxin can be aerosolized or put in food for consumption. If it were to be disseminated into the food processing or distribution system, a perpetrator could easily cause botulism cases throughout the United States in only a few days. Specific countermeasures include the provision of the C. botulinum antitoxin and supportive care to victims. We'll wrap this section up by talking about patient care after a biological incident. There are many ways to accomplish medical triage in a disaster setting. In the mass casualty module, several triage methods will be highlighted. However, it is important to consider that there will be modifications for emergencies involving large numbers of patients suffering from an infectious disease, and there are many good references that were developed during preparations for pandemic influenza. In large outbreaks, there may be a need for multi-stage triage where people move from self-selection to clinical second-stage triage where patients are triaged into categories that are appropriate for an epidemic. For example, clinical triage issues of specific interest might include such triage as: first, exposed and well; second, exposed and ill requiring further triage; or third, exposed but protected due to medical prophylaxis or vaccination. Additional considerations may influence triage, such as the availability of resources such as ventilators or dialysis equipment, and may require ethical decision-making for issues of resource management. We will also talk briefly about the pharmaceutical stockpiles of critical medications and vaccines. State and local health departments have the responsibility to prepare for bioterrorism and maintain pharmaceutical stockpiles to augment community response efforts. To improve the response capacity of the United States, a national stockpile of essential pharmaceuticals and medical supplies, or the Strategic National Stockpile (SNS) program, is overseen by the CDC. However, the implementation of the pharmaceutical stockpiles will remain a labor-intensive preparedness task for local health responders. During an emergency response to a biological agent, stockpiles of medicines and vaccines will be extremely important and will require considerable attention during implementation. Important considerations include: A. Gathering a pharmaceutical workforce; B. Coordinating a mass response program with multiple agencies and volunteers under disaster conditions; C. Ensuring that dispensing services are appropriate; D. Ensuring consistency with state and local response plans; and finally, maintaining adequate security. ESMAT members may play a critical role in augmenting the capacity of state and local health departments with mass prophylaxis or vaccination during an emergency. The SNS serves as a repository for antibiotics, chemical antidotes, antitoxins, life support medications, IV administration, airway maintenance supplies, and medical surgical items. In the event of a disaster, these federal assets can be moved to the scene to help responders and victims address medical needs. We should also talk briefly about the evacuation and transport of biological agent victims. The evacuation and transport of biological agent victims may require a few adjustments to the standard patient transport procedures. ESMAT responders should be aware that certain facilities during an epidemic may be reserved for trauma victims and normal hospital services. Practical solutions to limit the spread of infection during patient transport should include the use of dedicated transport staff for medical prophylaxis, vaccination, reverse isolation of patients during transport, and the utilization of dedicated vehicles for evacuating patients who share the same disease. Now we will move from biological disasters to chemical disasters. Chemicals are found everywhere in homes, schools, stores, hotels, businesses, industry, farms, and ranches, and are being transported in vehicles, trains, planes, and watercraft. Human exposure to hazardous chemicals can occur during manufacturing, transport, storage, usage, and deliberate acts such as terrorism. Historically, our greatest concern to human health related to acute chemical exposure is the risk from military and industrial sources. The use of chemical warfare agents during World War I ended the notion that chemical agents could be effectively banned. The first chemical agent used in large quantities was chlorine that was released by Germans during a battle in 1915. More than 168 tons of the chemical was released into the opposing military line, causing thousands of casualties within minutes of release. Most chemical agents of this era had localized effects to the skin or toxic effects to the respiratory system, with some notable exceptions, such as mustard agents, which could also cause widespread systemic effects to the body in large doses. It is important to note that in World War I, the number of non-fatal injuries was extremely high when compared to the number of fatalities. This resulted in a tremendous strain on the medical system. By World War II, a German scientist had discovered an effective pesticide, sarin, the first chemical warfare nerve agent. This class of chemical agent was distinctly different from the earlier generation of chemical warfare agents in that they attacked the nervous system and was capable of causing death or injury at relatively low levels of exposure. In 1995, members of a Japanese cult released sarin gas into 5 trains of the Tokyo subway system. This resulted in 12 deaths and widely varying injury counts. Reports record between 1,000 to 6,000 injuries, although most accounts support the higher numbers. Part of the confusion results from problems classifying who was considered a victim by the attack because health effects are dose-dependent. Secondary victims were created due to the fact that the sarin can cling to clothing for around 30 minutes, facilitating its spread to others, including first responders, and contaminating emergency equipment, emergency vehicles, and hospitals. Beyond military or war-related chemical weapons use, there are many additional chemical threats to consider. Acute chemical exposure may also occur as part of an industrial disaster, as a terrorism event, a natural disaster, or as the result of a transportation or storage accident. One of the most serious disasters occurred at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India in 1984. During the Bhopal chemical incident, there were multiple failures related to emergency preparedness and response to an acute chemical exposure to a common industrial chemical, methyl isocyanate, or MIC. MIC is a toxic chemical that causes chemical burns to the skin, respiratory tract, and mucous membrane. Severe exposures can be lethal, and moderate exposures can be debilitating. A combination of plant failure and operator error led to a large quantity of MIC being released into the atmosphere during the night. Because MIC is heavier than air, and it was a cold December night, the chemical release moved in the direction of the wind close to the ground and into an adjacent densely populated community. The plant external alarm system was not activated until much later, after the chemical had moved into the community. As a consequence, more than 20,000 people were affected and more than 2,000 deaths were reported. The confusion of night and the lack of warning increased the number of casualties due to the fact that many victims were unsure in which direction to flee from the hazard. An exhaustive review of the event showed there were multiple failures related to plant safety, emergency notification, training, civilian preparedness for acute chemical exposures, a lack of PPE, and a lack of knowledge concerning hazards facing the civilian population. An all-hazards approach to the threat of an acute chemical release begins with proper planning. One important focus of this planning must include the existing industrial chemicals that are stored and transported within our communities. Each of these represents an increased likelihood of unintentional or intentional release, causing injury to the population close by. Human exposure to hazardous chemicals can occur during manufacturing, usage, transport, or storage of materials. There have been a number of reports that suggest an increased need for chemical preparedness among health responders. The events during the sarin attack of the Tokyo subway in 1995, in which 12 persons were killed and more than 5,000 were injured, highlight many of the challenges facing healthcare workers when faced with an acute chemical emergency. For SMAT personnel, the issues and challenges identified in this Japan-based incident are the same concerns that will be faced in the field deployment site, rendering aid during casualty management after an acute chemical release. This includes surge management, decontamination of casualties, and PPE use by the SMAT personnel. First, healthcare facilities, including field-based medical care facilities, may be overwhelmed with chemical casualties after even a modest chemical agent release. For example, following the Tokyo subway sarin attack, St. Luke's Hospital in downtown Tokyo saw more than 500 victims within the span of 2 hours. The majority of victims did not utilize the emergency medical services system for transport to healthcare facilities, but rather sought conventional means like cars, buses, taxis, or even just walked to seek healthcare. The least serious tend to arrive for treatment during the early stages of the emergency response. Estimates are that fewer than 10% of the sarin victims were transported to healthcare facilities by EMS. There were immediate issues related to chemical identification, activation of the hospital's emergency plan, decontamination, and access to antidotes. Although more than 15 years have elapsed since the Tokyo subway sarin incident, a number of important lessons are still valid for healthcare workers attempting to manage patients suffering from acute chemical exposures. First, it remains difficult in the U.S. to prevent casualties who may be contaminated from entering our healthcare facilities prior to decontamination. Secondly, it is critical to protect healthcare staff. Lastly, few healthcare facilities can decontaminate large populations during surge conditions. A number of planning documents and information are available for healthcare facilities related to chemical preparedness and response to consider. In addition, there are excellent courses related to hazardous materials preparedness in most communities. For more information, refer to the Hazardous Materials module. Situational awareness of a chemical release may come from many sources, including transportation, law enforcement, and environmental protection services. However, healthcare providers, including field-deployed medical staff, will often not be aware there is a problem until chemical casualties begin to appear in their clinical facility. In responding to an acute chemical emergency, it is important to rapidly develop information on the type of release, whether victims have been exposed to dangerous chemicals, and whether responders will require specific adjustments to PPE. In addition, staff in receiving facilities will need to know whether they need to activate their emergency response plan, particularly if there's going to be a need for mass patient decontamination. This slide presents some specific information of interest to healthcare providers attempting to care for victims. Important to consider are the type of chemical event, type and amount of the chemical released, number of victims exposed and or injured, need for decontamination of victims, number of field workforce responders who may be affected, PPE requirements, and the need for antidotes or specialized medical care. We will finish out this section by talking about a few issues of mass casualty care related to acute chemical exposures. The basic principles of patient triage remain in effect for injured persons who are suffering from an acute chemical exposure. However, the triage of chemical casualties may require some modifications to ensure that victims with serious injuries can be stabilized from immediate life threats and then re-triaged as soon as decontamination procedures are completed. It is important that some degree of triage and patient decontamination be accomplished at the same time. Triage may have to be altered in a chemical event because many triage systems, like smart triage, are based on trauma rather than medical presentation. It should be remembered that treatment of chemical casualties, such as acute organophosphate exposures, can begin before decontamination has taken place. The potential for life-threatening chemical exposure, combined with likely acute traumatic injuries resulting from an explosion or fall or other event, will add to the complexity and anticipated higher acuity levels of these patients being expected. In acute chemical exposure events, there will be a risk of chemical contamination of patient transport vehicles and crews if patients are not decontaminated prior to transport. If complete decontamination is not possible prior to patient transport, EMS personnel must use appropriate PPE. The contamination of EMS vehicles and crews is a significant concern as they are leaving the scene and will be arriving at a distant, valuable healthcare facility that may now be placed at risk of contamination. Additionally, contaminating an EMS unit and its crew reduces the capacity and capability of the overall casualty transportation mission, as the time and personnel utilized to decontaminate and clean the vehicle and crew for continued use is considerable. Air transportation should not be used if any risk of contamination may be present that can impair the flight operations and crew members. An explosion is defined as the release of mechanical, chemical, or nuclear energy in a sudden and often violent manner, with the generation of high temperatures and usually with the release of gases and rapid movement of the surrounding medium like air and nearby objects with tremendous force. There are many facets to the basic science of explosions. The application of this basic science is important to understanding the injury patterns likely to be encountered in casualties from an explosive event. A key principle to understanding explosions is the speed of the reaction. For example, a burning log of wood generates heat and releases gases, but because it is occurring relatively slowly during an ordinary combustion reaction, no explosion occurs. Rather than explode, the heat and gases dissipate into the local environment or medium, which is usually air. However, if it were possible to release all of the heat and gas, generating potential energy of that same log of wood in one instant, then an explosion would occur. This results because the surrounding medium would be unable to rapidly dissipate the heat and gases, and instead would be forcefully compressed by the tremendous forces generated. The tremendous and sudden release of energy, or detonation, can cause a near instantaneous rise in pressure that generates an invisible shock or blast wave transmitted at supersonic speeds. This rapidly occurring shock or blast wave has a shattering ability. This is quickly followed by a rapid fall in pressure. This fall, or negative pressure, creates a suction-like phase of the blast wave. It is this cycle of rapid, tremendous rise, followed by a very rapid fall in surrounding pressure, that gives explosions their severe destructive shearing force. The force of the explosion is largely determined by the amount of explosive material and the velocity of the reaction. Other factors may also play a role. This blast wave can also reflect off of surfaces like walls, windows, people, body armor, etc., causing multiple cycles of blast wave shattering and shearing destruction, all of which occurs in a fraction of a second. This is why an explosion in an enclosed space, such as a building or vehicle, is usually more damaging than the same explosion in an open-air environment. The surrounding medium in the local environment does impact the effects of an explosion. For example, blast waves are magnified in water and will extend much farther than in air. The same size and speed of an explosion occurring underwater is likely to be more damaging compared to if it had occurred in air. Following the blast wave, the surrounding medium that was compressed by the instantaneous pressure rise now rapidly decompresses and causes a tremendous rush of air with a force that can be very destructive, literally blowing through or propelling nearly any structure or item in its pathway. This can cause significant damage to the local area and any living person or animal in its pathway. The tremendous forces involved in this explosion will cause many items to be fragmented. This fragmentation can send projectiles at body-piercing, life-threatening speeds for hundreds or even thousands of feet. With any significant injury release, as noted above, a significant release of heat or thermal energy is also likely to occur. The resulting destruction and potential injuries to people from its heat energy is significant. Burn-related injuries would be expected after any explosion. When a detonation as the one described here occurs, other chemicals or substances in the area may be disrupted because of exposure to the destructive forces caused by the explosion. This could result in another explosion if these substances are susceptible or volatile under these altered conditions. The containers of such chemicals or substances are likely to be damaged. This may result in these substances being dispersed within the air or simply leaking potentially dangerous contaminants. In this next section, we will talk about the 4 different types of blast injuries. We'll begin with primary blast injuries. Primary blast injuries are caused by the shock or blast wave that nearly instantaneously occurs from tremendous overpressurization. Injury from blast overpressure is a pressure and time-dependent function. Increasing the pressure or its duration will cause the severity of the injuries to increase. The reflection of blast waves, allowing for multiple blast waves to strike a person from different directions and angles, such as occurs when an explosion has happened in a closed space, may also significantly increase the number and severity of injuries. There are many additional factors that interplay to determine the severity of injuries from primary blast waves. These include time or duration of exposure, distance from the explosion, and the surrounding medium. The injuries commonly seen from primary blast waves are the air-filled areas, or so-called hollow organs of the body. This includes portions of the auditory, pulmonary, and gastrointestinal tracts. The effects can be immediate or delayed. One of the most common blast injuries is the rupture of the tympanic membrane, or eardrum. The consequences of ruptured eardrums include loss of hearing, ear pain, and balance problems from vertigo and dizziness. This may complicate the hearing of important commands as well as self-evacuation. Triage methods and commands may be less effective if such impairments in hearing and balance are present. The pulmonary system effects from a primary blast injury are serious and can be life-threatening. The air-filled lungs make them susceptible to the effects of blast waves and their shattering and shearing forces. The term blast lung refers to a severe pulmonary contusion or bruising of the lung tissue. There is also bleeding or swelling with damage to the alveoli and blood vessels, or a combination of each of these. For our advanced medical providers, in addition to the pulmonary contusions, other chest injuries may include hemothorax, pneumothorax, traumatic emphysema, subcutaneous air, and even alveolar venous fistulae leading to air emboli. The onset of difficulty breathing with a variety of associated symptoms such as rapid shallow breathing, chest pain, difficulty speaking in complete sentences, decreased breath sounds, wheezing, cough, and hemoptysis may occur immediately or may develop over the first several hours following a blast injury. The pulmonary tract injuries are a common cause of death among people who initially survive an explosion. Not all of the blast wave injuries may be immediately detected. The damage to the air-filled intestines, as well as their vascular and nervous supply, may not be clinically obvious as it takes time for the signs and symptoms to develop, such as the onset of abdominal pain, distension, nausea, vomiting, etc. Next, we will talk about secondary blast injuries. Secondary blast injuries are the most common type of traumatic injury following an explosion. The air rush that follows the blast wave is responsible for causing secondary blast injuries. The air rush propels the bomb fragments, or shrapnel, as well as debris and other objects in the immediate area of the explosion through the air with body-penetrating and life-threatening force and speed. The blunt and penetrating injuries resulting with secondary blast injuries are the most numerous injuries caused by explosions overall. External bleeding from resulting open wounds, as well as internal bleeding from disrupted blood vessels, can be significant and life-threatening. Associated fractures of bones and structural damage to vital organs like the brain, liver, spleen, heart, and kidneys must also be considered. It is important to note that improvised explosive devices, or IEDs, are often augmented with additional trauma-causing materials like nails, screws, bolts, and glass. These are added for the single purpose of causing more severe injuries through the fragmentation and shrapnel caused by the explosion. Tertiary blast injuries result from the air rush after the explosion, literally blowing people in its path to the ground or against solid objects. These casualties suffer blunt and penetrating trauma from being forcefully thrown into the various structures in the area. Fractures, wounds, bleeding, and life-threatening injuries to vital organs can occur. In addition to the blast wave and air rush effects as described in the primary, secondary, and tertiary blast injuries, there are additional mechanisms of injury that must be considered. For example, these include burns, crush injuries from falling objects and structural collapse, and exposure to contaminants resulting from the explosion. These are quaternary injuries. Thermal energy release can be very large, and the resulting burns to casualties are an important consideration. Management of burns, including airway and respiratory support, pain control, wound care, and fluid management, as well as multi-organ dysfunction when significant large body surface areas are involved, may be encountered. Falling objects and debris may cause a variety of crush-related injuries. An extremity may be crushed severely, leading to significant bleeding, wounds, or deeper tissue damage. A compartment syndrome in an extremity may be developed if a severely crushed area swells to the point that the blood supply and tissue are compromised from the dense edema within the fibrous wall surrounding the muscles of a given extremity. This could result in tissue damage and eventual loss of the extremity, requiring amputation. Crush injuries sustained against the chest wall, for example when a casualty is pinned between immovable objects, can compromise a person's breathing because they cannot expand or contract their chest. This is known as traumatic asphyxia. A crush injury that has involved large areas of the body, involving damage to large muscle groups, can cause crush syndrome. Crush syndrome is the result of a body's inability to manage the breakdown products of crushed muscle and related tissue, leading to buildup of cellular waste products and large shifts in intra- and extracellular fluid. This results in systemic acidosis, hypoxia, ischemia, and electrolyte imbalance, which leads to multi-organ system failure and death. Another consideration in the quaternary group of blast injuries is contamination by toxic materials affected by the explosion. Disrupted storage containers, industrial materials, burning plastics and textiles, or intentionally placed chemicals or materials attached to a bomb may cause a wide variety of additional injuries and serious illness. Also, the underlying medical condition of the casualty prior to the explosion is a consideration in this group. Someone with underlying asthma or heart disease, for example, may have an exacerbation of those illnesses as a direct result of the explosion. The majority of field medical management will be due to traumatic injuries following an explosion. The pathophysiology section of this module describes the multiple mechanisms of injury that can result in blunt and penetrating injuries. It is important that those SMAP personnel responsible for delivering medical care to the casualties be up to date in the treatment of acute traumatic injuries. The detailed description of all basic and advanced management for trauma injuries is beyond the scope of this course. The mainstay of early traumatic injury management must focus, as it should on any patient, upon airway, breathing, and circulation status. The sustainment of vital signs should always be the primary focus of any SMAP personnel providing field medical care. Hemorrhage control measures should be commonplace in the skill set of such SMAP personnel due to the high likelihood of penetrating and blunt trauma leading to significant bleeding. Assuring adequate oxygenation when possible in the field environment is also important, using supplemental oxygen and proper delivery devices. Stabilization of fractures with proper splinting is important for hemorrhage control, pain control, and functional preservation of the extremities or areas involved. Providing adequate hydration through IV fluids or oral fluids is an important part of managing circulation in the field setting. Again, the amount and seriousness of the traumatic injuries will dictate the interventions and should be based on solid skills and knowledge in current trauma management. It is important to note that most of the deaths in large-scale explosions are immediate, and the most common injuries seen are soft tissue injuries. In the Nairobi U.S. Embassy terrorist bombing, 99% of the nearly 200 deaths occurred on the day of the blast, and the most common cause of death for that incident was head injuries. Regarding specific organ systems, some unique characteristics of injuries are recognized based on the type of explosion. For example, the lung injuries noted after terrorist bombings can show unique patterns involving both lung injury caused by the blast wave and penetrating injury caused commonly by metallic fragments or objects. As noted previously, the mechanisms of injury for explosions cause many unique and challenging clinical presentations. Head trauma with immediate or delayed signs of altered mental status may be related to a life-threatening intracranial injury, like a subdural hematoma or epidermal hematoma. Spinal injuries may be present and demonstrated by impairment or loss of movement or sensation. Recent literature has also noted the complexities of managing burn patients from explosions due to the other multi-system injuries and has suggested that a burn-specific plan be important in the planning for future disasters. The management of these complex and traumatic and medical conditions is beyond the scope of this course. However, the awareness of these potential complicated casualties is important for all SMAT personnel. Close observation for acute exacerbations of underlying clinical illnesses in any casualty should always be done. The clinical management of typical chronic diseases should always be an important part of planning and logistics for the field medical care site. After initial stabilization of the injuries and illnesses, the focus must immediately be upon the evacuation and transportation of casualties to an appropriate trauma center or healthcare facility for definitive care. The likelihood of delayed onset but nonetheless lethal injuries is not uncommon in casualties from explosions. The delayed pulmonary, neurologic, and gastrointestinal injuries are important examples of organ systems where life-threatening decompensation may occur. Underlying penetrating or blunt injuries needing timely surgical care, complex fracture management, and symptomatic anemia in need of blood products are just some of the many issues warranting timely transfer to definitive medical care. An important part of situational awareness is threat recognition. Explosions can occur in many situations and from a variety of causes. They may be the result of a transportation accident, an industrial accident, or a consequence of a natural disaster. There may be a single or multiple explosions during a given event. The causes may be accidental or the result of an intentional plan, like a terrorist bombing. SMAT personnel at the scene or working at the deployment site may be working nearby or have potentially explosive substances in the immediate area. It is important for all SMAT members to recognize such threats and take appropriate actions based on their situational awareness. As a general rule, every SMAT member should consider that if one explosion has occurred, the likelihood of another explosion is a realistic consideration. Maybe even more important for the SMAT member is the awareness and recognition of secondary devices. The term secondary device refers to the intentional placement of a pending explosion or other injury or illness causing mechanism that is meant to occur at some time after the initial event has occurred. For example, placing a bomb near the scene where a bombing or other event, like a shooting or fire, has just occurred for the purpose of causing more injuries or deaths is one use of a secondary device. Historically, these secondary devices are meant for the responders or crowds gathering in the early aftermath of the inciting event. Medical responders, fire personnel, and law enforcement are at risk from such dastardly, intentionally planned events. The importance of recognizing concerning packages or devices at the scene, as well as utilizing only equipment that is known, is important at any scene. Maintaining proper communication with incident command, assessing all casualties for weapons or devices, and knowing immediate evacuation routes are examples of very important action items. Finally, we should mention dirty bombs. The term dirty bomb is usually applied to an improvised explosive device that has been augmented by adding a dangerous substance or perceived fear-provoking material to the device. The use of a bomb as a dispersal device to disseminate a substance by the explosive force is the underlying mechanism of injury for a dirty bomb. For example, attaching radioactive material, like radioactive medical waste, to a bomb is an example of a dirty bomb classically described. The explosion is obvious, but the detection of an additional material may be initially delayed. The presence of a significant contaminant beckons the need for more resources, decontamination measures, and media attention. The radioactive substance utilized in this example may cause actual health concerns, or it may not. The ensuing panic and fear resulting from such an event may be the greatest actual threat to injury, illness, and mental health to those involved. Although commonly described, radioactive material is only one example of dangerous or attention-gaining materials attached to bombs. The use of infectious material or a particularly toxic chemical are other examples that have been previously utilized as dirty bombs. Because of particular social concerns and apprehension about radiation, any disaster event that involves sources of radiation will likely carry with it significant community psychosocial responses. The additional impact of the worried well or the low-risk patients may even overwhelm your response capabilities. In summary, disasters resulting from intentional or unintentional releases of chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, or explosive materials can cause particular challenges for emergency response teams. You may face additional risks of exposure to yourself, team, and victims. It is essential that you have a basic understanding of the risks and mitigation techniques if you're going to be effective.